So today we're going to be talking about front-end testing and specifically using this popular library for front-end testing called Cypress. So I am going to do a little bit of a review of like what is testing, why do we do it? We'll talk a bit about the types of tests. And we might have seen a little of this. Has anyone encountered like this? What different categories of tests we can write?
It's like end-to-end testing.
Yeah,
Unit testing.
absolutely. End-to-end tests, unit tests. And then there's one more, if anyone might know it. And if not, that's okay. That's what today is for.
Integration testing.
Yeah, integration tests. So, and DJ, do you have any context or like what is, let's start with unit testing actually. Can someone maybe tell me their understanding of like what a unit test is?
Would that be more like the individual methods to your objects and whatnot?
Yeah, exactly. We are testing an individual unit or part of our whole system. So some example, so a unit test tests one individual part of the application. And some examples are, like you said, testing a function or method. You could even say testing a class is a unit test, because if we have a program with many classes, if we were writing some Python code, right, then a unit test that tests that one part of the application makes sense. In React, testing a component might be considered a unit test. So a unit test is one part of the whole. And anyone want to take a stab at what an end-to-end test is?
It's
Like
Like testing the user interactions
yeah, like the whole
with the
application
interface.
as a whole.
Yeah, totally.
what Jake said.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'll switch back to let's switch back to the raising hands mode, because I appreciate how active and participative you all are, and just with 37 of us, I should make sure to do that. Otherwise, it's hard to not talk over each other. And yeah, you all hit the nail on the head. An end-to-end test is kind of like what it sounds. It tests the whole application. And in particular, it might test like one particular flow through the whole application. And let me give an example of what I mean. So an end-to-end test tests the whole application, ideally simulates how, or ideally not even simulates, it runs the application the way it would be for real. And we might test, and an end-to-end test is good for testing behavior. So say, for example, user is able to log in. User is able to create an account. Right, and so some of those monkey patchings that you've seen when we had Python tests where it was looking at like feeding your program command line input and looking at the command line output, running the application the way it actually would be and simulating the user, that's an end-to-end test. An integration test, any thoughts on what this one might be? Kara, yes.
It's just like testing how your data flow is. So like specifically like how the components work together, right?
Yeah, the second part, what you said there is spot on. The integration tests how different parts of your application work together. Tests that different parts of the application are working together. So these boundaries can get a little fuzzy, but some examples of this might be testing that we are able to update the database, right? Testing that the part of our application that talks to the database is correctly able to talk to it. Testing that they're integrated correctly. Testing that we are calling an API correctly. And it can get a little fuzzy with integration tests because sometimes we might have to fake some of this stuff, but ideally, in a perfect situation, you would actually want to call the API or call the database on a practical level, especially with like more complex real world systems where maybe the database is really big, or maybe there's a third-party API. Like if the data in your database is constantly changing, that can be a problem. So sometimes like these services might be faked. But companies actually do invest a lot of effort in proper integration testing. Like Netflix, for example, I'm sure has ways to test that their parts of their system are talking to each other for real. And one approach is often to have a whole test environment that is maybe you're the same. You've got a database deployed to AWS and you've got the whole app running, but you like keep some fake data in the database so that it's consistent when you run your integration tests. So testing can end up being like a really complex subject. So we'll circle back in just a moment to talk a little bit more about what is testing and why do we do it. Just to kind of finish the overview of what we're going to look at today, we're going to talk a little bit about pros and cons or trade-offs of testing. A little bit of review on TDD. I'm going to talk about testing frameworks for React, just to give a little bit of an overview. And then we're going to see Cypress, which is a popular framework for writing sort of end-to-end tests with React. And so we'll see how to install Cypress. We'll see how to configure Cypress, and we'll actually write some Cypress tests. And we'll see different ways to run Cypress because it gives us some pretty good tools. So we'll definitely get some hands-on time with Cypress. But so this is really the agenda for the first part of our morning is we're going to talk a little bit about testing, and then we're going to dive into Cypress, see it, and then you all will get a little bit of hands-on time. So we've talked a lot about different kinds of testing. And can someone maybe remind me, like, what's your understanding of why do we do testing at all? Why is it such a big thing in the industry? Brett, yes, sir.
To make sure all your stuff works okay.
Yeah, exactly. Make sure the program runs correctly and that stuff works. What are the thoughts that people have around like why do we do testing? Why does it matter?
I've got one. Oftentimes testing is sort of the outline for the steps you should take. So testing is often the first step before you actually start designing.
Yeah, totally. That's called test-driven development, as you all know. And so TDD style testing can actually be a part of the design process. And there is definitely a school of thought out there that says tests are documentation. And there is something to it. The more you write code, like when you see a well-written test suite, say like if you see a bunch of unit tests for a Python class, that is a really useful guide as to how to use that. especially like in large code bases on the job, less so with open source projects, but where there's more of an emphasis on documentation. But even there, there's definitely a school of thought, and there's a lot to be said for it, that tests provide good documentation to other programmers about how this thing should be used, because a test is sort of like living documentation, right? If it's not correct, it'll break. Yams, yes, sir.
It's a way to preserve your source code integrity as you add new features. So maybe you add a new feature, but your previous tests break, and that's not something you want.
Yeah, that is a really, really good point. And you touch on a couple of things here. So testing improves, let's say, code quality. The term is like, it makes it easier to add new features and refactor, because if I make a mistake along the way and break something existing, my test suite will catch me. And this is called a test harness. And there's a great book on it by this guy, Martin Fowler, and titled Refactoring. And this is actually a really big deal in big code bases. Because I'm sure you all have had the experience of changing your code and introducing a bug along the way. And I think you all have written enough code now to realize that being like a great software developer isn't about not making mistakes. Programmer error is inevitable. Being a great software developer is about having a workflow and a process for how you write code and how you test code that minimizes the chances of making mistakes, but most importantly, catches them, right? And makes it easier to debug and fix them. And so as our code bases get bigger, writing tests helps us a ton with this. And this is around code quality and maintainability. And related to this, Jordan, or Yams, I think made a good point as well. There's something called a regression test, which is where, let's say, some user reports a bug in our application. Well, my job as a software engineer isn't just to find and fix the bug. It's also to write a test for that behavior, because if a bug made its way through our review process into production, into the live app, that tells us this is a trickier area and it's easy for a bug to slip in. And it turns out it's really common to fix something and have the bug come back. Right, so that's a sign that this is actually a good spot for a test. So a regression test is a way to confirm that a bug fix stays fixed, and also document this for other programmers, because it might not always be obvious what the issue is, especially with the subtle bug. So as our code bases get bigger, you can all, I think, imagine the value of this, where if you have a really big code base and you have a really good set of test suites, you can have a much higher degree of reliability in changing code, in being able to make reasonable estimates about how long something might take, and also to make sure that the code works. And because we're doing software engineering in a business environment, whether it's for a for-profit company or a nonprofit or the government or what have you, the limitations are always time and cost. Testing is a hugely important part of this as well. And then, of course, making sure the program runs correctly is a really big deal, right? With, say, the unfortunate, disasters like the Boeing 737 MAX being a recent example, though that might not have been solved with better software testing, but the software definitely played a role there. There's a ton of stories that you can go and find So as like the value of whatever our software does increases, being able to validate that it's correct becomes more and more important. And related to that, sort of related to this, while it's not testing per se, bugs are less expensive to fix the earlier we find them. So investing the time in testing can save time and money, because if a bug makes it into production, it's much harder to find. So, and let me just pause here and see if folks have any questions. And let me catch up on whiskey questions real quick as well. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about pros and cons and trade-offs of testing. So we've covered a lot of the pros. I think the pros are pretty much listed above. The bigger your program gets, tests can save you time. What are some of the cons? I would love to get people's thoughts about like real or perceived cons. Yams, yes, sir.
Oh, it makes development slower at the beginning because you got to spend time writing tests.
Yeah, it takes time. And the truth is, it's not just at the beginning, though that is often where the biggest investment needs to be made. It's a continuous cost, because every time you write a new feature, you need to write tests for it. There is absolutely a time cost to writing tests. And as we'll be discovering with React and Cypress, the more complex our applications get, in some ways, the more that time cost can grow. Writing tests takes a significant amount of time. What are some other cons? Whether, and I'm curious too, if folks have had any experiences, like from just in the class, some cons that you've encountered with testing.
The only thing that comes to my mind, oh, sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, go for it. All good.
The only thing that comes to my mind is is just, I run the test. Like I remember Monkey Patch, and it's like, yeah, and it gives you some error, and you're like, what the heck is that? So like when it does something that you don't even expect or didn't even think about. So, but it goes along with what Yams already said with the time factor, but that's all I can think of. I see other people, so I'll let them go.
Yeah, and I think that's a good one too. Because it's not just time, it's also complexity. You have to learn the testing framework. Writing end-to-end tests is more complex. Like there's actually like if we actually do like pro cons of different testing strategies. Unit tests, the pro is they're relatively fast and simple. Lots of little unit tests, or lots of, I shouldn't say little, but lots of unit tests of poor, low-level functionality can help give confidence. The con is we don't test like full program behavior, and unit tests are just much more limited. On the other hand, end-to-end tests, and I think this raises to your point, the pro is we are testing real end-to-end application behavior. And this gives us a high degree of confidence, right? The con is end-to-end tests are absolutely more complex to set up, especially like if dealing with external systems, input, etc. And the tooling is more complex, right? Monkey patching and all of that, it's just more complicated. And I would say integration tests have similar pros and cons to end-to-end tests. So there's very much like well-known trade-offs that occur for like each of these kinds of tests. A lot of folks will like push towards end-to-end or integration tests because although it's more complex, it just gives you like if the test passes, you 100% know that your program is doing what it should be for that particular test. For a unit test, I could test every single class of my program, but if there's a problem with how I'm using the classes, the unit tests won't catch that, right? So unit tests, like for low-level core functionality, like that's maybe if I have a class that's inherited by a bunch of other classes or just used by a bunch of other classes, that there's maybe a lot of bang for my buck in writing unit tests for that one, but not necessarily for others. So I think those are some very real pros and cons. And I did see some other folks had their hands up, so I just want to check in because I apologize if I missed them. Okay, cool. So I think this is a really solid like pros and cons lists of testing. I will say there's one other con to testing, which is can the test tell you about the problem in your code that you don't write the test for? And that's a little bit of a trick question. And the answer is no. Like if I don't write a test for something, then, it's like the old saying of you don't know what you don't know. Like a test is only as good as the test itself. Testing, like can't tell us about stuff we don't test for, unknown unknowns. And also, tests can be written wrong. Right? If I write a test, but maybe the test isn't correct or there's a subtle error in it, then I might have this like falsely placed confidence in my program. And then you end up debugging the tests, and obviously like writing tests for tests is just a bridge too far. So, it's sort of like binoculars or a telescope or something. Like you can zoom in on a lot and you can see a lot of stuff. And while end-to-end tests obviate this problem to some degree, because a test is only as good as what we test for, it's only one part of like code quality and maintenance and stuff. So do folks have any other questions about sort of different kinds of tests and their value and the role they play in the industry before we move on? Cool. All right, let's talk very briefly about test-driven development because I think we've talked a bit about this, and then let's dive into testing frameworks for React. But can someone maybe just give me like the 30-second summary of what TDD is? Well, I would say the 30-second summary is red, green, refactor. Write the tests first, then write the code to get it to pass the tests. And the goals of TDD are to force you to work in small chunks, to force you to think about what, you know, your function or class should do before you write it. It's not quite the same as pseudocoding, but it ticks a lot of those boxes and it sort of forces you to do that and to improve workflow and productivity. Because ideally, once you have the tests written, it helps you focus your efforts and write to the tests and you get a nice workflow. You know, part of that goal is also like limiting scope. The idea being like, well, I'm working on a feature, all I need to do is to get it to pass the tests, and anything not related to that, I don't need to think about. And then the last thing, obviously, is bake in writing tests to the process. Some people love TDD, some people hate it. There is, I have to say, a lot of value to this. And what I have observed is that with senior software engineers, even if they're not using test-driven development or they're not fans of it, they end up replicating this sort of workflow. Like I will just have my code running with a little program. So like every time I save it, it reruns and I use console logs as sort of my informal testing, but I very much use the same sort of workflow. And I honestly suspect part of the reason that test-driven development got so popular is because it forces junior developers to follow this workflow. So it's not always like natural or intuitive, but that's sort of where a bit of where test-driven development comes from. Part of why it's seen as valuable within the industry and also why it's important to know about, because there's a 50-50 chance that either during the interview process or on your first job, you will be encountering like some variation of the test-driven development workflow. All right. Any other questions about TDD? Cool. How do folks feel about a quick 5-minute break? And then we can dive into talking about like React and Cypress. Awesome. Let's take 5, and then we'll start looking at testing frameworks for React and digging into Cypress. Thank you very much, folks, and see you in 5 minutes. So just to summarize with testing, we've got unit tests, which take less time to write and are really good for low-level stuff, but don't give us as good coverage or confidence. We've got integration tests that are sort of in between to make sure different parts of our application are working together correctly. By the way, speed is also an issue. Like if an integration test is making API calls and we have 100 integration tests, that's going to take way longer. Unit tests are probably going to run faster. And then we have end-to-end tests that like actually run the program and simulate user behavior, however the program is meant to be used, that evaluate our application as a whole. And this sort of gives us the highest degree of confidence, but they can be brittle, they can run slowly, and maintenance takes more time. What to write tests for? Functional logic. This is like unit tests. And again, like you want it for the more important low-level stuff. Testing that you interact with APIs and databases is always good. User interface testing, which we're going to see a ton of with React. And then like core application behavior. And you can do that with end-to-end testing as well, especially for features. And then we talked about writing tests for when we find a bug, which is called regression testing. And so there's a lot of pros to testing: bug detection, quality assurance, maintainability, a test harness that helps us for refactoring, adding code. It definitely takes time. And the term test coverage, like, do I have an end-to-end test for all the features of my program? Do I have unit tests for all of my classes? Teams are perpetually chasing 100% test coverage and never getting there. So there's very much a trade-off, and different teams will have different testing strategies. This is all stuff that's a little hard to see right now in the class because our applications aren't big enough, though you've seen lots of tests and you'll continue to see them. However, this is really good stuff to review when you start interviewing because companies care a lot about testing. So being able to demonstrate that you have some knowledge of testing and the different kinds of tests and their importance is really valuable. So I would kind of flag all this stuff as part of, like, when you're preparing for an interview, some of the conceptual stuff to review and bone up on. All right, let's talk about testing frameworks for React. So I think the most obvious and biggest question is, how the heck do I test a program that's running in the browser? And what do I want to test? Because, you know, with JSX, there's not really the same thing. It's not like testing a function or a class. And what I really want to test is that stuff renders on the screen correctly. And so a lot of front-end testing leans more towards end-to-end testing, because the gold standard would be to run our React program in the browser and have our test suite, like, you know, grab DOM elements to make sure that stuff is there. So test frameworks for React kind of solve this problem by a couple ways. For end-to-end tests, the React program is run in a browser, and the browser is controlled or driven by the test. And honestly, this is kind of true for most front-end testing as well. And so, in fact, I wouldn't even say like that this is necessarily about end-to-end testing. How to test a UI, right? How to test something running in the browser. And so this is, with front-end testing, this isn't just about end-to-end testing, it's also used for unit tests and integration tests. And this is what we're going to see today with Cypress that does this, and Puppeteer is another tool that does this as well. Another testing strategy is and sorry, let's put that there and let's make this a heading like this. And an important term here is a headless browser. And this is literally, say, a version of Chrome that runs but has no visual GUI or UI. So I could say, run this headless browser on the command line. So another testing strategy for front-end testing is to simulate the DOM. And this can be done with Jest, and there's this library, React testing library, and these libraries are always changing. So I think I'll throw this in here. This is going to be a lot more similar to when you write a unit test. So the advantages here. So the pros of the running in the full browser is you get, like, you're really running the program in the real environment. Much like an end-to-end test. And the cons are the same too. The pros of simulating the DOM are it's faster. It's not necessarily less complex, though it usually is. And the cons are your tests can't test real behavior. It's close, but it's not quite the same. And then the last front-end testing strategy is something called snapshot testing. And this can happen in different ways. One way is where the program is actually run in the browser and literal screenshots are taken. And then you have to run it once to like get your good snapshot. And then when you run the test again, if the next screenshot is different, then that tells you there's a problem. So snapshot testing is a whole other strategy. And this can be done with a headless browser. Or there are ways to do it differently. Where maybe we look at a JSON object representing the React virtual DOM or representing a component. So this is maybe somewhere in the middle between an end-to-end test and a unit test. And I think I'll share this one here. And there's a couple different like snapshot testing libraries as well. We are going to focus on actually running the program in a real browser, and that's what we're going to use Cypress for. And that is generally where you get the most bang for your buck, though all of these have their place. So front-end React app testing can be a little funky, but these are the three main strategies. So let's take a look at Cypress and dive on in and get some code and stuff running. And let me go ahead and pull it up real quick. I do have it over here. And the two big tools, by the way, for doing this, there's Cypress, and then there's something called Puppeteer. And Puppeteer is for really controlling the browser, and people also use it for web scraping as well. So we're not going to use it, but just so you know that that's the other sort of popular tool for actually running the browser. And Cypress is a whole thing because you can sign up and they have pricing and all this stuff. And kind of as they say here, this is like a next generation tool built for the modern web. Cypress was really created, and it's a for-profit company, so really big companies like sign up for Cypress accounts. Like once the problems of front-end testing were understood. And as you can see, they sort of say, hey, you can write all sorts of tests with Cypress. So let's go ahead and start installing Cypress and see what this looks like. So I am going to go ahead and make a new React project. And let's just name this Hello Cypress. I am going to go ahead and create our default React app in there. And let's go ahead and do npm install. And we're going to install Cypress in just a minute. And let's do npm run dev just as a sanity check. And actually, while I'm doing this, let me catch up on Whiskey questions. And I apologize, I should have checked in if folks have questions around front end, this sort of big picture overview of how to do front end testing. Okay, cool. So to reiterate, Cypress is actually going to run a browser that's actually going to run this React app. And this is very much like writing end-to-end tests, though we use Cypress for all the different kinds of tests. And we're actually going to interact with the DOM. Most of these front-end tests, like it becomes difficult to like test component state or what props are getting passed in, though you can. So a lot of front-end tests just look at what gets rendered to the DOM. And since React is all about building user interfaces, that sort of makes sense. So let's go ahead and get Cypress set up and see what we can do with it. And so, you know, as always, I want to look at the getting started in the Cypress docs for installing to see how to install this app. And here, I only have to install the Cypress library, and we're going to install it as a dev dependency. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now and run npm install cypress --save -dev. And I have not yet opened a folder. All right, let's open a folder. And let's just open this one right here. And now if I look in my package.json, I see that Cypress has been installed in my dev dependencies, right? Because when we're actually building like the production bundle of JavaScript and stuff, we don't need to include the testing suite. So this only gets installed for development stuff. So there's some best practices. There's some other things here that we can all ignore. Pretty much it looks like we're good to go. And it says next steps is open the app and take it for a test drive. And we can actually run Cypress from the command line, which is actually pretty cool. And it actually gives us a pretty neat user interface. So let's go ahead and do this and see what this looks like. And remember that npx is the command we use when we want to like run an npm module from the command line. So this Cypress module has some like command line scripts in it. And interestingly, it looks like somehow that did not get installed when we installed Cypress. So I will just hit yes. So I may have to exit the full screen here. Let's see how we do. Though this error is a little unexpected. Let's see if I have Cypress opening or if I need to do something else. Let me just exit full screen real quickly. I can remember how to exit full screen. There we go. So I don't think it opens Cypress in another window. I'm pretty sure we're going to have to do a quick check to see what this error is. I have a couple of suspicions. Let's see what's going on though if I run it again and if we run into the same thing. So I suspect this may be like a Mac thing. And speaking of, there we go. Speaking of Mac things, I'm not sure why that is getting totally stuck there. So let's try quickly Googling this error and seeing what the internet says. I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole here, but if we can get this sorted pretty quickly, then we'll get it sorted. And clearly I'm not the first person to run into this. I should probably stick Cypress in front of that. And I indeed do see like a Mac related warning here. And the context here is that Mac has gotten a lot stricter about like what programs are allowed to do what. So as soon as I saw like sort of enable secure coding and all this stuff, this is like how sort of Mac system stuff is written. It gets dealt with. So this looks like it's related to Electron. If this becomes too much of a rabbit hole, and I apologize about this, folks. I may have to hop offline real quickly just to get this sorted and working, because I think that there is, yeah, let me come back to that one. But let's go ahead and finish configuring Cypress and then we'll take a break. So there's a little bit of a hiccup with Max and Cypress that is more recent that we'll solve, and we'll get to see what Cypress does in a minute. But we've gone ahead and installed it, and our next steps are going to be able to set up a configuration file for it, and then add a little bit to our project structure. And then once I get it working, I think I'll show. I think I'll show adding some NPM scripts. So we want to add a file named cypress.config.js. And because this isn't source code, it's not going in the source directory. It's going in the top level root directory of my project. And I need to put a couple of things in here. From the Cypress package, we need to import something called define config, which is a function that we're going to run. And I don't want that to come from Vite. Vite must have one as well. I want it to come from Cypress. And when we run Cypress from the command line, it will use this config file. So we are going to export this, and define config is a function that's going to return a configuration that gets exported. And this function takes an object as an argument. And there are a couple of things we need to put in here. We need to give Cypress some settings for end-to-end testing. And I need to give it the URL that it should actually like first open up in the browser to run the end-to-end tests. So this is going to be the URL of where our React app is running. A support file is how you can add more custom behavior as this like pop-up hints. It can load some files before the test loads. We are not using a support file right now. If we were, we'd put the path here, but we can just put false. And we need to tell Cypress what we want the width and height of the viewport to be when it opens the browser. And we're just going to use some pretty standard settings these days of a width of 1024 and a height of 768. And if we wanted to, Cypress could even record a video, which is incredibly useful as like application behavior gets more complex. So if you had a designer on your team, or like a UX user experience designer, or maybe a product manager or someone that wants to see the video to make sure everything looks and feels right, Cypress can do that, but it takes more time, and we are not going to do that right now. So we've set up that config, and I think that's probably a good stopping point, because I want to make sure that I can get that side issue resolved, and then we can continue on. So why don't we take 10, and then we will actually get Cypress running and write some tests. And let me pause and see if folks have any questions before we break. Okay, awesome. Folks, thank you very much, and I will see you all in 10 minutes. All right, so it turns out that that error was actually just programmer error on my part in not using Cypress correctly and making some bad assumptions. Just to quickly recap, we have installed Cypress in the top level directory of our project. We created a cypress.config.js file with a very basic Cypress config that tells it where to go, or rather what URL to load, because we're actually gonna, Cypress will actually open up a browser and then open up our app in the browser. And the issue that I was running into is that if I try to run that Cypress command, npx cypress open, well, now it's working because I have my dev server running. But before the break, I did not have the dev server running with my actual React application running and hosted somewhere. And I ran npx cypress open. Oh, and now it's working. I wonder if this is maybe from having created the config file. So I apologize. There may be two sources of this error, but what it comes down to is to use Cypress. First off, we need to create this config file. And then the second thing that we want to do is we need to make sure that our React program is running with Vite dev server, which we do with npm run dev, because Cypress is going to open a browser that will interact with it. So just to simplify your workflow, what we recommend is you will want to have two terminal tabs, both in the root directory of the project. And go ahead and run the React app first and make sure that that one's running, which we'll need anyway. And then in the other one, we can run this command npx cypress open. And this is what I was expecting to see before. And I'm not sharing my screen yet, am I?
Yeah, you are.
You're not you're not sharing the other screen where the test suite's popping up. It looks
Yeah, let me go ahead and. Can folks see my screen right now? And is there this giant welcome to Cypress window?
Yes.
like
Okay, awesome. I'm so sorry about that, folks. So just to recap, I've got these two tabs, both in my project root. I've got my Vite dev server running for my React app, which I've got hosted and live here. And then I'm running npx cypress open. So to use Cypress, we need to make sure that we've created the Cypress config file that lives in the root directory of the project. We need to make sure that we have our React app actually running so that this URL is actually live when Cypress tries to open it in its browser. And then I can run npx cypress open, and it opens up this pretty nice user interface. And we're going to go ahead and do end-to-end testing. And here we can choose a browser. So those of you on WSL2, Windows users, I believe you have to use Electron, because since the Vite dev server and Cypress are running inside your Linux virtual machine, the WSL2 virtual machine, they can't talk to Chrome. I think there's an issue there. And Francisco, thank you for pointing that out. So if you're on Windows, use Electron. Otherwise, I would say use Chrome. Chromium is an open source version of Chrome. If you're on Linux, you might want to use Chromium, but you can probably figure that out for yourself best. And I'll try to demo Cypress with both of these, but I'll start with Chrome. And so let's just hit start end-to-end testing in Chrome. And we haven't written any tests yet, so not a lot is going to happen, but let's just see what Cypress does. So there are no specs yet. There is no test to see. Once there is, there's a lot of nice stuff here that we can actually look at and interact with. But let's go ahead and actually create a Cypress spec or test file, as they call it. And what I want to do is I'm going to go back to my project for a minute. And I think I'm going to kill the Cypress server. And I believe that'll close that out. And I want to make a new directory at the top level of my project named just Cypress. So let me make sure I'm where I want to be. I'm going to make a directory named Cypress. And so, oh, I apologize. That is, I'm one level out. And in fact, let me move, I'm so sorry. Let's move the Cypress config into Hello Cypress and let's delete that. So this was just my confusion. I was in my demos and notes repo. So now this is all where I want it to be. And now I want to make a directory named Cypress right here. So just to reiterate, this is all in the root directory of your React project with Vite. And in the same place where we've got the package JSON file, we have the cypress.config.js file and a directory named Cypress. And whenever we create a test inside the Cypress directory, we need to name it ending in like .spec.js. And we also need to create a directory in here named E2E for end-to-end tests. So let's go ahead and make a directory Cypress/E2E. And then inside there, let's make a file just, it's not the worst idea to start your tests with a number if you want to be able to keep track of the numbering. And let's just name it like vite init.spec.js. And we're just going to write some tests against this default React application that Vite gives us. And let's actually go ahead and write a Cypress test. And to do this, I'm going to use a describe block. And let me actually make sure I'm not missing any imports. Yeah, so Cypress will inject this describe function. And it's going to take a callback similar to what we saw before with jests. So the first argument to this describe function is the description of the test. And then the second one is this callback function, this arrow function. And inside here is where we actually write each assertion. And we use this function it, where we say, and again, the first argument is a description. And the second argument is an arrow callback function. And I will add closing brackets I need and my semicolons and fix the typo there. And it looks like I have a typo here. So let's quickly fix that as well. And now that looks much nicer. So Cypress, I'll double check this is right, that this name is right, but Cypress gives us this object, and I believe it's going to inject it into the test named CY, which is short for Cypress. And we can, we'll take a look at the Cypress docs in a minute to kind of see what our different functions are and what we can do here. But we can use a command visit to navigate to a URL. And because in the config, and did I lose? Interesting. Did I lose my Cypress config along the way here? It looks like when I copied stuff around, I might have lost my Cypress config, but then this got created. So
I think there was just some copying and pasting that happened. in the
Yeah.
wrong- We just need to set this back to what it was before.
yeah, thank you. Let's just quickly set this back to what it was. Yeah, that looks like a different way of doing the same thing. And where I was going, I'm glad I ended up checking here, is because in our config for end-to-end testing, we set the base URL. We can then just use that. We don't have to type out this full URL when we're actually writing tests. And we don't want support file. And our viewport width was 1024. And the viewport height was 768. And we're not recording video. And let me double check to make sure I don't have any typos or anything wrong here. But that looks about right. So coming back to here, because I've defined the base URL here, in this visit command telling Cypress to go to this URL, I can just have a slash, which is the base URL of my application. And then what we can do is, like we've seen with interacting with the DOM, rather than having to type get element by ID, we have a shorthand method named get. And again, we'll take a look at these at the Cypress docs in a minute. I just want to get this up and running. And we're using method chaining here. And like we've seen with other assertions, here the way we write an assertion is with should. And this string contain is a special argument that we're getting passed in here, where we're telling Cypress what kind of assertion it is, that this H1 element should contain V plus React. So let's go ahead and run this and confirm that it works and see what happens. And I'm going to double check that my vdev server is still running. And let's run Cypress again. And let me bring it over here. So npm Cypress open, again, opens up their sort of visual user interface. We're going to do end-to-end testing. Again, WSL2 users, you'll want to click on Electron. I'm going to go ahead and do start end-to-end testing in Chrome. And we can ignore that and just hit. Let's see if this is the joys of using Cypress. I'm not even sure if I'm able to do this. I might just kill and restart the Cypress again. And worst case, maybe use Chromium. There we go. Let me kill this and run this one more time and see what happens. And it looks like I might have gotten something wrong in writing my test.
Can I see your folder structure?
Yeah, thank you, Francisco.
Yeah,
So-
of course. Oh,
I've got Cypress in the top level outside of source. And then inside Cypress E2E, and then inside there 0-v-init.spec. Oh, Brian, what's up?
When I was playing around with this, I noticed that there's a file name convention that Cypress expected to see in between spec and JS. A .cy was what helped me make it work.
You mean renaming the file to spec.cy.js?
That's what worked for me.
Let's see if that does it. There we go. Thank you so much, man. Okay, so I apologize, folks. That was a change that I was not aware of. So now we can see Cypress in action running a spec. Yeah, Brian, thank you so much, man. And we can see a lot of really useful information about our test. And when Cypress runs the test, it records like each action it does against the DOM. And so we can see here what's happening. And here we can see this assertion. And this should indeed be passing. And indeed, we've got this check mark here next to the test showing that it's green. And if I want to run all tests again, I can click there. Just a number of preferences that we can fiddle with here. And like we can see the different test runs, though. Let's see if this makes us connect to the Cypress service. This one might be connected to Cypress Cloud. Again, these look like they want us to use their service. There isn't too much we should have to do here in project settings. And in fact, we're going to be running this on the command line. But this is pretty cool, right? Because we can see this test running. And in fact, if we want to here, we can actually click on the URL. I can't interact with the application here, but I can actually see this happening. And let's go ahead and just to demonstrate, let's go ahead and run this in Electron just to watch the same thing happen. And Electron is an environment for running JavaScript that has a browser built in, and Slack is actually built in Electron. And here we see something very, very similar, right? Where we can actually see the tests running and each step along the way. And let's actually change this test. Let's change it to something that we know will fail just to see what that looks like. And let's open up Cypress again and run this. And so as soon as we start adding more tests here, we'll see them showing up. And now this test is running and it takes a minute and we get a failure. And we can see that we get a really nice error and assertion message. We can see that Cypress tried this a couple times for 4 seconds. And after then it stopped. And there's a stack trace here if we want it. And I believe the timeout is related to the assertion failing. Yeah, I would have expected a bit more of a printout of like the diff between what was expected and seen, but we can see pretty clearly here, like they give us the test itself, and then they're giving us the line in the test where the assertion is failing. And let me go ahead and change that back to be working. And let's add another test here. That's going to be a little more interesting. And let's look at, say, the value of this count element. And this is where it does testing and writing code start to intersect a little bit, because I do want to make it really easy for my test to grab the property of that count and see what it is. And so because I'm feeling lazy, I'm going to add an ID to my button, and we're going to call it count button. And that's going to make it easier to then actually get the count button ID. And we can do CY, and I believe it will be get, and it will look something like this to get count button. And we can do should contain. And I'll make this as a string just to be safe. And in fact, it's not quite 0, its count is 0. So let me go ahead and update that in my test. And let's go ahead and run this. And again, here we see both of our assertions passing. And this is where the testing can start to get a little more interesting, because we can also have Cypress click on the button and then confirm that the count has incremented successfully. And let's do that in just a minute. I do want to quickly just show some of the behaviors and features that Cypress gives us. And let me go to the right Chrome. And if we take a quick look, and let's actually just go to the API. And if we look under queries, so we can see that very similar to how we're manipulating the DOM, Cypress gives us a lot of really flexible tools. We can get things by class or by ID. We can find things within there. Here we're finding a div or whatever element has the main nav class, and we're finding a list element. We can get an input. We can use this argument invoke to do all sorts of interesting things. We can stub and we can spy, but the one and do things like focus on a list element. And the one that I'm interested in at the moment is clicking. And so we can see there's a whole list of actions here that we can do. And once we have an element, we can call this click function on it. If we wanted to, we can even have a crazy level of control over clicking on a specific part of the button, which I suppose is maybe for checking if you had like a really complex button. There is an action here for double click, for right clicking. If we find an element, we can scroll into view if we needed to test scrolling for some type. So there's just a very rich set of actions that we can do here. So between like all these different kinds of queries that we can do, And let's take a look at invoke, because I think that one's a little interesting. So it invokes a function, which looks interesting because we could actually maybe call like a JavaScript function that's in there. We can navigate to somewhere else if we needed to by changing window.location. We could go to the next sibling in the DOM if we were, say, checking a bunch of list elements. And there's also first and last for different siblings, but let's go ahead and just use the click, and let's go ahead and write another test. So I think I want to demonstrate let's show just writing another file and maybe multiple describe blocks and it statements. So let's add another it here. And let's say ensures count button default value is correct. And let's go ahead and put this over here. And I'm going to need to visit the home page again, because each test, I believe, is running independently. So now we've got this as two tests in our describe block, which helps us in terms of debugging if we see a test fail, and also just as our tests get more complex. And it is a good practice to try and have each individual test be as simple as possible. And let's go ahead and write another test. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file here. And Brian, again, thank you so much. And we'll call this the init. And I'll just do maybe dash count dot spec dot cy.js. And I am going to go ahead and copy this and use this as guide code. And I don't need my second it statement here, but I do want the first. And I'll just duplicate that same test we had before. Confirm button default value is correct. And so we're going to the home page, and we're not going to get the H1, but instead we're going to get the and let me make sure I get my ID correct here. The count button. And I'm actually just, I'm going to borrow this whole bit of code. And now we want to test that the count button increments by 1. So again, we're going to visit the home page. We're going to get the button. And we're going to click on it. And now we're going to do our assertion. And maybe, in fact, what I want to do to make life a little simpler, just because I'm writing this twice, is maybe I want to create a little var, and let's call it count button. And let's do our get statement here. And then over here, I can just do count button dot click. And then I can do count button should contain count is 1. And I'm actually going to set this to 2 because I want to watch it fail, because that's not a pretty good practice when doing test-driven development. And so let's run Cypress again and see what happens. And after this, we'll see how, we'll take a short break and then see how to set up some NPM scripts so we can run Cypress tests from the command line and don't have to go through this whole flow every time that we're doing Cypress tests. So here are the specs, and I can see that now I've got two options. Now that I have two different test files, I can see when the file was last changed. Not sure if we can see latest runs every time we run Cypress. And so these run and they're looking good. So let's go back to our specs, and now let's run the other specs. And as expected, our second one failed. Though let's see here. The button is correct. I would have expected to see something here, but maybe this is from the test failure. If I go back here and I click on these, we're seeing what we expect. And if I go back here and I click on this, oh, I see the tests are still running. And let's go ahead and change the count back to 1 to see if it works, though it looks actually like it may not have liked this. So let's find out. I think I'll just comment that out and comment that out. And we'll make a quick change here, where we will click. And now the count should be 1. And let's pop back to Cypress. And it's already reran these tests. In fact, I can just change my code and then Cypress will update and run these tests again. And so I apologize. It looks like this Cypress, either I made a mistake or Cypress did not like something about how I did that. And actually, I do recommend writing code this way because it's simple and explicit and easy to read. And now, if we change this to something that we know is wrong, and we go back when this test runs again, it should fail and we should see the more expected error message. And note that before, when I had an issue in my test code, we weren't even getting the count button. But now I can see that this works. I can see the click works. Note that we can see the change, visually the change in state as I click on each of these steps. Here I see now that count is 1, and then this is where the assertion error gets thrown. So I'm going to change this back to be correct. And now we see that this test again is passing. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have. And let me pull up the participants channel. I see in Whiskey Questions a good question about the name of the test directory, where I named it end-to-end, but in the curriculum it's integration. I would just name it end-to-end for simplicity. I'm pretty sure if we named it integration, the way that we see our whole folder and directory structure and everything inside Cypress here, we would just see Cypress/integration, and we could interact with tests the same way. And in fact, we can go ahead and try this out. Let's just go ahead and make a new folder and call it integration. And I am going to kill this, and I am going to copy Cypress end-to-end 0 into Cypress integration. So we should now have, it's the same test, but for our purposes, it'll work just fine. And let's see what happens with Cypress.
I think you have to update the config file as well.
Oh, that is a good point. I bet you are right. Let's see how far we get. So yeah, it's only looking in the end-to-end directory. And yeah, I suspect we probably need to add integration here. Does that seem about right?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think so as well. We can double check the Cypress docs, but since they kind of like Cypress talks about different kinds of tests and here they have it named end to end. I'm pretty sure we have to add this here. Let's kill and rerun Cypress and see what happens. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Francisco. No, we're not seeing it show up. So I'm sure there is somewhere in the Cypress docs, like if we search for Cypress, define, config, directory name, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole. I'm just curious if there's like a quick answer to this question. Testing specific type options. Yeah, so I am not sure. I'll follow up, but I think the safer path is just name that directory end to end, and we might need to tweak the curriculum. And I think that makes more sense anyway, especially since as we're like looking at this Cypress docs, like we can see that Cypress thinks of it as like end-to-end tests versus component tests. So we might as well kind of follow the convention that Cypress has to make it easier to read. Oh, yes, was there a question?
I think sound like somebody's dog barking.
Yeah, okay, I think we just had a hot mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sure there's a way to use a different directory name. Well, I'm relatively sure, but just name it end to end for now for simplicity and clarity, and because we know that that's working. Yeah, great question, Natalie. Thank you for checking in on that. Do folks have any other questions?
So I'm assuming this is something we'll need to get comfortable with as part of just our pretty consistent, processes as we get into our jobs. Is it safe to assume like Cypress is something we'll have to be acclimated with? Or, I mean, obviously it's just like anything else, I suppose. Maybe we'll use another testing suite, but it'll have some form of like similar layout process.
Yeah, I mean, and not only that, I believe the React assessment uses Cypress tests. And we do want you all to be writing and working on tests. And yeah, absolutely, testing is a huge part of software engineering work. And if you're doing front-end work, you're going to be using Cypress or Puppeteer or just the snapshot testing. So this is a good place to start. Yeah, is there anything on your mind, Michael, about this that you're kind of curious about? Like whether it's how Cypress is behaving or maybe how to set it up and run it?
Yeah, I was gonna just kind of review it, but I was just happy. I saw that they have supposedly on their browser support, it like parses somehow and it sees that what you use for browsers. And I was happy to see I had like Firefox Dev Edition included in there. So I was trying to follow along. It was telling me it installed some like config files and stuff
Yeah,
I'm going through.
I would not recommend using Firefox Dev Edition. So you raise a good point. Because Cypress is actually running a browser, you really, really want that to be stable. And the world of front end, first of all, most front end folks are going to be using Chrome DevTools. You can, I'm sure there's a way to use Firefox Dev Edition. There's probably a way to set this up for Safari. And in fact, testing code in different browsers is an important part of front-end testing. That's a whole rabbit hole. Honestly, the easiest thing is probably like if you're on a Linux machine to install Chromium, which is an open source version of Chrome. I would recommend that over Firefox Dev Edition, like if you're unable or don't want to use Chrome for some reason. Because it's like the whole connection between running the browser and Cypress can get kind of finicky, to be honest. So you really just want to use something like stable that other devs are using a lot. Kara, yes, what's up?
I'm not sure if you're like planning to get to it or not, but I was just curious about the video function and like what would be the intended purpose for that?
The intended purpose, we can try it out. The intended purpose is like, let's say you're working on let's say maybe you're working at Apple and you're working on the Apple Store, and we want this really beautiful like drop down where when you open it, it like has all of this sort of animation. So this way you record a video and someone can watch the video and manually confirm that it does what it's supposed to. And I'm curious if, well, I may have aborted this run too early, but what'll happen is then that video gets put somewhere, probably inside Cypress. But that's the purpose of recording a video. I would have to dig a bit more in to see where that gets put. But then like a designer on the team or yourself or someone else could review it to make sure that it's behaving correctly, that we're seeing the right kind of like animations and stuff like that. Let me go ahead and I think just show the last bit of setting up some NPM scripts to help with this, to make this a bit easier. And then that'll be a good breaking point. And then you all can have some work time to create a new React project and install Cypress and write a couple tests. And let me go ahead and open package.json, and let's go ahead and just add a couple things to it. So we've been running Cypress from the command line. And first off, it would just be nice to have an NPM script, since that's how we're used to running everything else. And second of all, it'd be nice if we could maybe have a tighter workflow with Cypress, because while that visual UI is really useful, and as you all saw, like I don't actually have to kill and restart Cypress every time I modify a test. I can just leave it open. Sometimes I might just want to be able to run my tests on the command line. So let's add a couple NPM scripts here to help us with both of those things. And what you'll often see with NPM scripts is this convention of when you've got multiple scripts related to like one thing, there's a colon in there because we're going to make a sci open script that is going to do what we were already doing. Instead of npx cypress open, I can do npm run sci open. And let's see what this did not like. Failed to parse JSON data. Package must be actual
Is it a
JSON.
missing colon right there?
Oh, there is totally a missing colon. Thank you so much, DJ. There we go. Let's try this one more time. Which is always a good reason why it's good to double check stuff. So this is just so I now have, I can run it with an NPM script in the way that I'm used to. This next script is the one that's a little more useful. And we're going to do sci::run because both of these are related to Cypress, and that's just a naming convention. And instead of an M, this should be an X because we're running Cypress from the command line. And let's see what this does when we run it. And this actually does a couple things for us that are nice. So because I have -- spec here, I need to pass it the name of the spec file that I want to run. So this way, if I just want to run, if I have a bunch of different tests here in different files, and I'm just working on one part of it, I can just run the test that I'm interested in and do it from the command line. So let's see what this looks like and make sure that I get it right. I believe we have to pass the whole path to the file and the whole file name itself. So it's going to look something like this. And 0-v-init spec cy, yes. And so now, and then if I wanted to run my next test, and this is where if like, instead of naming these different things, I just change it from 0 to 1, it makes it a lot easier to change this. Though a lot of the times you'll just be running the one file over and over and over, right? Especially if you're following test-driven development practices. And so now I can run my other test. And there's a lot of interesting information here, actually. So let's walk through this real quick. So here's where I'm running my second test file. And we see this same warning that got me confused before that we can actually ignore. And we see the run is starting. We see the version of Cypress. We see here, when we're running this from the command line, it's actually using Electron, which runs a headless version, I want to say, of like Chromium, I believe, the open source version of Chrome. And again, that's what Slack is written in. And that's why I would recommend, if you can't or don't want to use Chrome for some reason, start with Chromium. And we see the version of Node.js that's being used and the spec file that we're going to run. And we see just, here's our description from the describe block and our description of each assertion from each if statement. And let me bring that down so we can kind of see. We see that the tests are passing. We see the tests. We see the results. We see that it didn't take any screenshots or record video. And that it didn't take that long to run the tests. And for a sanity check, I'm going to go ahead and just change the count to 2. And if we run it, we should now see a failure. So it was trying a whole bunch of times on that second one, but it didn't work. And so here, if we look at what's printed out, we see again the tests that were run. One of them passed, and it tells us how long it took. And this is not a small amount of time, 260 milliseconds to, open up the browser, let it render, and look at it. And then we see that this second test failed. We see that the assertion error failed. Again, I'm actually a little surprised they don't do a better job of printing out like the diff right here, but we at least see where the failure is. And again, that's why it's good to make each of these it blocks like one individual test, because it makes it easier to debug it, right? If we had both of these in one it block, it might be harder to know what was causing the failure. But here it's pretty clear because it's got to be this assertion. And so we know the count isn't 2, and that can guide us in our debugging. And we actually did get a screenshot generated. And it looks like Cypress is doing that by default, which is actually pretty great. Let me go ahead and delete this integrations directory because that was from our failed experiment, though a good one. I just don't want it to clutter stuff up. And if we look at this, we can see that actually by default, Cypress is taking some screenshots for us, which is actually really, really nice. Though we probably don't want to check these into version control. So we have a screenshot, and I'm sure there's a Cypress config setting to disable screenshots, but this is nice when we run it on the command line that we can look at that if we want to. And so now we have a tool that can improve our workflow, and it's pretty common to be running Cypress from the command line like this. And I think the last thing I'm going to do is let's open up our git ignore directory. And let's add into it, and I'll just add it here at the top. We'll say Cypress tests, and we want to ignore Cypress slash screenshots. Right, because we probably don't want to be checking those into version control because they're not really that relevant. And I honestly don't know what goes in downloads, but we would probably want to ignore that as well. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have about running Cypress from the command line. Oh, and DJ, I see a great question here about a verbose option for Cypress when running tests. That's a great question. Let's find out. It may not, especially since it gives us that screenshot. Verbose debugging output set to true will yield verbose output. So this is more for injecting and for intercepting. So I am not sure. A lot of this stuff hooks into Chrome DevTools, to be honest. Like I think this would get us output into Chrome DevTools. So I think it gets a little more complex. I'm not sure if there's a straight up verbose output option. Yeah, I think the debugging is the way that you would do it with Cypress, which gets a little more complex. Like if we scroll down here, like here we can see what happens with debug. Right, because so much of the stuff is about what's happening in the browser. So this is what ends up being more useful. So if I needed richer information on something, like for my get, I could add a .debug here. And actually we can do this in a second, see what happens. And we see a whole bunch of information here, mainly about like what jQuery functions are used to get the DOM and exactly what it's doing. So I think that's the closest equivalent. There's also a pause command here, which is could be pretty useful as well, where like when we're running Cypress, if we want to pause the UI and then interact with it, we can. And let's actually just demo both of those really quickly. Let's in our test, and then we'll switch gears. So let's maybe do debug and then just do pause right there. And let's see what happens when we run this. Oh, so another point actually about like when you're running Cypress tests, if what browser to use, consider that like the vast majority of people on the internet are using Chrome or Microsoft Edge and barely anyone uses Firefox. So if I'm testing my program to verify that it's behaving correctly, it's way more important to verify that it's running correctly in Chrome. So let's see here, because we should hit that pause. And we actually are in the pause loop right here.
I see a play button. If that works like a regular debugger, you might be able to hit the next step up top there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. The regular debugger would take us to the next step. And since this is a browser, I can open up DevTools. And so the clicking let's make sure I'm doing this right. Within the subject, current subject that is yielded by the side.get is exposed as a variable subject within your developer tools. So I think I'm using the developer tools in the right spot. There we go. For some reason, the mouse click was just not clicking, and I don't know if that's a Cypress thing or what. No, we can like do different stuff with viewports here. But so here we see this debug info. That's really more useful in terms of seeing what Cypress is doing. And we can resume to click through here. This also lets us like, this is getting a little too deep into the weeds. I'm not sure if there's a good way to hook into the Chrome debugger, but we can see like all the elements on the page right now, which is pretty cool. You know, we can open up the div and we can find count hiding in there. And this is getting a bit more advanced, so don't worry about this too much. And we can interact with our HTML page in the DOM via the console as we normally could. And then I think exactly like you're saying, if we hit resume, it will now finish the test, which is actually pretty cool. Oh,
So it looks
and
like the pause looks like a breakpoint.
yeah, the pause is a breakpoint. That's exactly what it's doing. It gives us a breakpoint, and then we can use Chrome DevTools to interact with our application at that point where like the DOM is what it would be and everything else is what it would be to see what's going on. And the debug is a little less useful. And this test failure is just because at one point I changed the test to fail to count as 2. Do folks have any other questions around Cypress? This is a bit more advanced that we're getting into now with debug and pause, but sort of the basic idea and what we saw with writing tests and running them from the command line. Okay, awesome. So that really covers everything we had for today. I think I want to give the rest of the morning as work time. And what I would ask for you all to do is pretty much go ahead and build on your own what we did here this morning. Create a new React project and install Cypress and set it up and write a couple tests. And I'll push up this code, so feel free to use this as a starting point. But then from there, experiment a bit more with what Cypress gives you. I think if we go to like their API docs, where did they hide? I always get lost in documentation websites. Here we go. Like play with some of these assertions, which come from Chai. Like there's not equal, there's a deep equal, there's nested property. So, you know, maybe experiment with like throwing like a couple other things on the screen. We saw that. Where are their actions hiding? And I'll share the link to where the good parts of the docs are, because to be honest, it always drives me a little mad finding things. But so we saw there's click, right? But there's a command to check a checkbox to clear an input. So experiment with like adding an input field and a checkbox and trying to write some simple tests. Like try to write a test to clear it, like check or uncheck a checkbox and run an assertion on it. Write a test to try and clear an input field. Scrolling might be a little trickier to do. write a test to grab a drop-down option. I think those would be great stretch goals, right? Like add a couple things on there, like a checkbox and an input field and a drop-down, and then write a couple assertions like we did just to do something really simple with them. And that's the plan. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.